On April 13, 1945, in the devastated town of Nordhausen, American troops marched men from the city into the ruins of the Bölke barracks and forced them to unearth and carry corpses, some still clinging to life, into hastily dug mass graves. Under U.S. supervision, these civilians dug and placed more than 1,278 bodies in anonymous pits over several days. We have photographic proof. German civilians from the town of Nordhausen bury the bodies of former prisoners found in the Nordhausen concentration camp in a mass grave. Yet, many locals would later insist they never saw anything. Meanwhile, in Buchenwald, just days later, German civilians under American escort were forced to gaze upon a wagon heaped with corpses, bones, bodies, human ruin. On April 16, 1945, one U.S. liberator, when asked about Buchenwald, reflected, "You couldn't grasp it all. How could a population deny such horror until forced to bury it?" This confrontation was not accidental. The U.S. Army in liberated Germany deliberately compelled civilians to bury the dead and view atrocity, compelling them to face the violence unleashed in their name. These shocking episodes raise a fundamental question. How did Allied commanders justify forcing citizens to bury the dead they claimed never existed? To answer, we must trace the discovery of mass death, the policies of military government, and the lived experience of Germans thrust into a moral reckoning. Until April 1945, the German population lived behind walls of propaganda that made the unimaginable seem impossible. Joseph Goebbels' ministry of propaganda flooded newspapers and radio with triumphant bulletins promising Endsieg, the final victory, and branding Allied atrocity stories as Anglo-American lies. In his diary of 9th March 1945, he wrote, "Our people do not believe these monstrous fabrications about camps." Bundesarchiv NS 6567, Goebbels Tagebücher. This assurance echoed through the Völkischer Beobachter, which mocked reports of crematoria as enemy invention. According to the U.S. Psychological Warfare Division's April 1945 assessment, more than two-thirds of German civilians still believed news of mass killings to be propaganda designed to weaken morale. Even as Allied tanks closed on the Thuringian hills, Wehrmacht bulletins boasted of new miracle weapons and heroic last stands. Captured officers later admitted that nothing in their briefings prepared them for what American patrols would uncover at Ohrdruf and Buchenwald. In towns like Weimar, residents wrote letters ridiculing BBC broadcasts about extermination camps. One preserved in the Bundesarchiv sneers, "These tales of crematoria are English propaganda. No German could act so." When the 80th Infantry Division entered Ohrdruf on 4th April 1945, its discovery of hundreds of charred corpses instantly shattered that illusion. Eisenhower himself ordered photographs and eyewitness visits precisely because, as he told reporters, someday there will arise the claim that this never happened. His foresight exposed the scale of denial confronting Allied forces. The contrast was staggering. On one side, a regime assuring citizens of victory and moral purity. On the other, the documented industrialized murder its victims left behind. Through months of total censorship, Germans had been conditioned to disbelief so complete that only the forced sight of corpses could break it. That disbelief, nurtured by propaganda, sustained by fear, and destroyed by proof, forms the backdrop to the moment Allied commanders compelled civilians to face the graves at Nordhausen and Buchenwald. In early April 1945, the men of the U.S. 1st and 3rd Armies were running on exhaustion and coffee. They had chased the retreating Wehrmacht across the Rhine in what official histories called the fastest pursuit in modern war, yet behind their tanks trailed supply convoys stretched to breaking, trucks low on fuel, medics short of plasma, engineers repairing bridges as soon as artillery shattered them. According to the Army's logistical support of the armies, every ton of rations travelled more than 600 miles from Normandy ports to frontline units in Thuringia. When patrols of the 80th Infantry Division entered the hills near Ohrdruf, they expected snipers, not slaughter. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Jackson later recalled, "We had no orders for this. No one expected mass graves." Across the sector, infantrymen carried disinfectant instead of shovels, field manuals instead of burial charts. The American Graves Registration Service could handle combat losses, but not thousands of starved corpses suddenly lying under open skies. General Patton's diary entry for April 12th records his revulsion. "We entered hell today." His army, bloodied but disciplined, now faced a duty no logistics officer had planned for: to restore dignity to the dead and confront living witnesses who denied they existed. Behind the cameras stood mechanics, clerks, drivers, farm boys, none trained for moral reconstruction, yet each ordered to document and to bury. Diplomatic cables from London and Washington reveal initial Allied hesitation, concern that photographs might be too severe for publication. Still, Eisenhower insisted that every record remain untouched. "We must document, lest denial arise." His words transformed the under-equipped, battle-worn American soldier into an unexpected custodian of truth. Surrounded by disbelief and decay, these troops, undermanned, undersupplied, unprepared, became the instrument through which the world first faced undeniable evidence of genocide. What appeared spontaneous, the sudden order for German civilians to bury Holocaust victims, was, in fact, grounded in methodical U.S. military policy. By April 1945, Allied headquarters had quietly issued directives anticipating the discovery of enemy atrocity sites. In SHAEF's civil affairs files, General Eisenhower's staff drafted procedures for the care, identification, and honorable interment of civilian victims, and the compulsory participation of local residents under occupation law. These measures, declassified decades later, show a deliberate plan to confront denial with evidence. Eisenhower's own dispatch of 19 April 1945 is unequivocal. "Let the world see what the Germans have done." That order, transmitted to 12th Army Group and all subordinate commands, triggered a coordinated response across American sectors. Within hours, civil affairs officers mobilized specialized units, quartermaster graves registration companies, Signal Corps photographic detachments, and public health service teams to secure camps, disinfect grounds, and document every body. Major General John C.H. Lee reported from the communications zone that emergency graves registration was now a priority equal to combat casualty management. Army engineers repurposed portable field cremation units, while logistics officers converted local horse-drawn wagons into corpse transports. Medical staff requisitioned thousands of pounds of lime from captured German stores to slow decomposition. Even amid fuel shortages, trucks were diverted from ammunition runs to haul wood for makeshift coffins. Perhaps the most striking innovation lay in communication strategy. The Psychological Warfare Division designed atrocity exhibits inside liberated towns, photo boards, captured SS records, and paraded civilians, all intended to break disbelief. Under Military Government Order No. 47, issued in mid-April, local mayors were held responsible for assembling burial crews, providing tools, and attending funerals as witnesses. This legal framework turned an improvised response into disciplined administration. Declassified SHAEF memoranda reveal that American planners viewed exposure itself as weaponry, truth deployed against ideology. The camera, the clipboard, and the spade became tools of victory. Through procedural ingenuity, the United States transformed chaos into documentation and disbelief into accountability, ensuring that the graves at Nordhausen, Ohrdruf, and countless smaller sites would stand not as propaganda, but as permanent evidence. By mid-April 1945, American commanders faced a grim logistical dilemma. The Third and First Armies had liberated more bodies than their medical and graves units could process. In Thuringia, the 104th Infantry Division's reports logged over 1,000 unburied dead in the Nordhausen barracks area. Quartermaster companies lacked manpower, and spring rain turned the campyards into slick mud. On 11th April, the 80th Infantry Division ordered local officials to assemble civilians for sanitary disposal of enemy atrocity victims, NARA RG 407. In Nordhausen, a grey dawn revealed rows of motionless figures, the silence broken only by shovels hitting frozen ground. American MPs herded townspeople up the hill under guard. The civilians, still clutching their ration sacks, muttered disbelief until they saw the corpses firsthand. Signal Corps photographs capture the moment. Middle-aged men in overcoats lowering emaciated bodies into trenches while soldiers stood watch. Every movement, from the first shovel of earth to the final salute, was timed and logged by civil affairs officers. SHAEF's 15th April directive formalized these impromptu orders. Local populations shall bear primary responsibility for the burial of victims of enemy atrocities. At Buchenwald, troops of the 6th Armored Division coordinated with Weimar officials to schedule civilian visits and funerals. The process was filmed for use in psychological warfare broadcasts. Weather reports note the ground half frozen, delaying burials into the night. Even as German resistance flickered elsewhere, Thuringia's hills became staging grounds for a different kind of campaign, against denial itself. Engineers surveyed grave sites, medics sprinkled lime, photographers documented each stage. The precision mirrored combat discipline, positioning, execution, verification. When a military clock struck noon on 13th of April, the first civilian burial crew began its march under American escort. By sunset, Nordhausen's valley had become both a graveyard and a courtroom, where silence replaced argument and evidence replaced propaganda. The order came at dawn on April 13, 1945. From the cobbled streets of Nordhausen, an American patrol rounded up every able-bodied man and woman they could find: shopkeepers, teachers, railway clerks, even the mayor. Armed soldiers herded them toward the Bulke Kaserne, where the reek of decay met them like a physical blow. Before them lay hundreds of corpses, skeletal forms sprawled across the courtyard, some still in striped prison garb, others naked and blackened by starvation. According to the 104th Division's report, local civilians were directed to bury approximately 1,200 bodies under armed supervision. Photographs confirm the scene. Townsmen, faces clenched in horror, lifting bodies onto makeshift stretchers, women pressing kerchiefs to their mouths. American MPs standing guard with rifles ready. Each corpse was laid in rows beside trenches dug overnight by engineers. The weather had turned raw and damp, the soil half frozen. Shovels rang like iron bells. Life magazine's correspondent described the silence of thousands broken only by the scraping of spades. At one point, a German woman fainted as a prisoner's skeletal hand slipped from a blanket onto her shoulder. An officer shouted for order. The soldiers did not intervene. They only watched, recording everything with cameras and notebooks. Nearby, General Eisenhower's earlier order was read aloud. "Let them see for themselves what their leaders have done." The phrase passed through the ranks, becoming a mantra of grim determination. In Ohrdruf, Patton wrote the same day, "We entered hell today. Civilians are digging the graves." At midday, when the trenches were filled, a U.S. chaplain recited a brief prayer for the dead, Jewish, Polish, Russian, unknown. Then came a moment no one forgot. The German mayor was commanded to stand before the open grave and salute. The gesture, captured on film, became a symbol of the reckoning Eisenhower demanded. By evening, the burial ground stretched across the hillside, marked by simple wooden crosses hastily carved from debris. Army engineers fenced the site, photographers took final frames, and the guards dismissed the shaken townspeople. "They could not speak," one soldier wrote in his field diary. "They just kept looking back." The day ended not with cheers of liberation, but with the dull thud of earth closing over truth made undeniable. Within days of the burials, The German facade of certainty disintegrated. Intelligence Summary number 215 described a marked decline in civilian morale following compulsory viewing of atrocity sites. In Weimar, where 1,200 residents had been marched through Buchenwald, military government officers reported streets unnaturally quiet, shops shuttered, church bells ringing for the dead. NARA RG 332. Interrogations conducted by the Psychological Warfare Division capture the moment denial collapsed. A local postmistress confessed, "I did not believe until I saw them carry the bodies." Another man, formerly an SA member, told officers, "We thought the camps were labor colonies. Now we know they were graves." At Nordhausen, army chaplains recorded civic leaders openly weeping as rows of crosses rose over the mass pits. Public weeping is now common, a counterintelligence report observed, especially among those previously most confident of victory. German signals intercepted by 7th Army G2 revealed officers in rear areas complaining of complete breakdown of discipline and faith in leadership. Rumors of the Allies forcing towns to bury tens of thousands of Jews spread faster than official bulletins. Within a week, military governors in Thuringia and Saxony reported an epidemic of apathy. Civilians avoided uniformed men, and local mayors petitioned for instructions on memorials to the dead they had denied. One diary from Weimar, now in the Bundesarchive, records a teacher's guilt. "I had laughed at the English lies. Now I have seen and cannot sleep." Another entry, dated April 19th, notes children crying at night after their parents told them what was found on the hill. The moral collapse was total and documented in dozens of field reports. U.S. civil affairs officers summed it in one sentence: "The enemy has at last seen itself." Propaganda was no longer possible against photographs and graves. From that moment, as recorded by the Psychological Warfare Division, the will to resist ceased where the truth was shown. In the quiet that followed, the sound of digging was replaced by the sound of weeping, and the collapse of a regime began with the collapse of its lies. The consequences of those April days were immediate and profound. Within a week of the forced burials at Nordhausen and Buchenwald, Allied headquarters declared the exposure of Nazi atrocities a strategic priority equal to the capture of Berlin. In his message to General Marshall, Eisenhower emphasized, "We must make this documentation unassailable." SHAEF G5 files, April 1945. The U.S. Army's Psychological Warfare Division reported that the effect upon German morale has been catastrophic. "The moral shock is permanent," report number 47. Civil affairs officers noted civilians volunteering information about hidden graves and SS hideouts, behavior unheard of weeks earlier. Meanwhile, the War Department issued photographs and film reels to American and British newspapers. The New York Times headline of 19th April 1945 read simply, "Civilians forced to bury camp victims." The images, lines of Germans carrying skeletal corpses, were reprinted globally within days. SHAEF's Information Bulletin number 22 ordered that each burial site be fenced, marked and registered as permanent evidence. The Nordhausen and Gardelegen memorials thus became the first officially designated Holocaust cemeteries under U.S. authority. Local mayors received written warnings that desecration of these graves will be punished as a war crime. Civil Affairs Division File 421. Medical officers reported that epidemic risk had declined, but psychological effects lingered. The townspeople move in silence. No one laughs. Propaganda divisions seized upon the shock to hasten surrender. Leaflets distributed over still-occupied regions showed photographs captioned, "This is what you fought for." Interrogations confirmed that such imagery accelerated desertions among German troops. In liberated zones, Allied correspondents described a new tone. Villagers leaving flowers on graves they had dug under compulsion. What began as punishment became reluctant acknowledgement. Within 2 months, the first German-language pamphlets about the camps were printed in Weimar and Nordhausen, beginning the long process of confronting guilt. For the Allies, the immediate impact was clarity. Moral victory required visual proof. The graves themselves became weapons of truth, and the war's closing battles were fought as much with cameras and shovels as with guns. The scenes of Germans burying Holocaust victims under American guard did more than end denial. They inaugurated a new chapter in moral history. The photographs taken at Nordhausen, Ohrdruf and Buchenwald were among the first exhibits entered into evidence at the Nuremberg War Crimes Tribunal. Prosecutor Telford Taylor told the court in 1945, "These are not propaganda images, but the literal record of what our armies found." IMT Proceedings, Volume 2. The trenches of Thuringia thus became a courtroom foundation for justice. In Germany itself, the memory of those burials evolved differently across decades. In the East, the 1958 opening of the Buchenwald Memorial framed the graves as warnings against fascism. In the West, early silence gave way to the civic reckoning of the 1960s. Historian Harold Marcuse later wrote, "The forced confrontation with corpses marked the first step in German Vergangenheitsbewältigung." East, German schoolbooks called the sites anti-fascist, lessons carved in earth, while West German teachers cautiously reintroduced the photographs into classrooms by the 1970s at Nordhausen. Townspeople who once denied knowledge became custodians of the memorial cemetery established in 1946. The stone monument raised a decade later bears the inscription, "Hier ruhen 1278 Opfer des Faschismus. Here rest 1278 victims of fascism. Flowers appear there every April, laid by descendants of both victims and former bystanders." In the United States, Eisenhower's insistence on documentation shaped Holocaust education for generations. His order that the world must see led directly to the creation of archival repositories, whose holdings later seeded the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. Army photographers became historians by accident, their reels transformed into permanent testimony. Academics now interpret the forced burials as pivotal in dismantling collective innocence. Mary Fulbrook notes that it collapsed the moral distance between perpetrator and bystander. By compelling physical participation, spade in hand, corpse on stretcher, the Allies ensured that denial could never again rest on ignorance. Today, both historians and educators trace a straight line from those April 1945 orders to modern human rights documentation practices. The principle forged at Nordhausen endures, that witnessing must be enforced when conscience fails voluntarily. The graves dug by trembling hands became classrooms of the future, and their legacy is the moral vocabulary by which civilization now defines genocide, responsibility, and truth. When Allied troops compelled German civilians to bury the victims of the Holocaust, they were not only closing graves, they were opening history. Eisenhower's words still define the purpose. "I made the visit deliberately in order to be in a position to give first-hand evidence to future generations." His decision transformed atrocity into testimony, ensuring that disbelief would meet evidence and silence would meet record. Those April days in 1945 revealed more than the ruins of a defeated nation. They exposed the frailty of truth when societies choose ignorance, and the strength of conscience when ordinary people are forced to look. The images from Nordhausen and Buchenwald, spades, coffins, bowed heads, became the moral punctuation at the end of a global war. From those graves emerged the first documents that would frame the Nuremberg trials, the Genocide Convention, and eventually the world's modern understanding of human rights. Every photograph, every U.S. Signal Corps reel remains an unbroken contract between witness and memory. The graves were meant as evidence, but they became lessons, that denial is a seed of complicity, and that truth must sometimes be commanded. At Buchenwald today, the memorial plaque reads, "Erinnern heißt handeln." To remember is to act. The act of remembering began not in silence, but in the scraping of shovels and the shock of recognition. For viewers and historians alike, these events demand more than reflection. They demand vigilance. Every generation inherits the duty Eisenhower foresaw, to confront falsehood with record and hatred with fact. The graves of Nordhausen are not relics. They are warnings carved in soil. As long as the photographs exist, the denial that we never knew will forever meet the truth that they were there, and they buried what they said did not exist.